Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. This is really an exhaustive presentation. Can you hear me well to start with?
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. So really, after looking into this presentation, although I have a few comments here and there on the content, but it's really exhaustive. So I don't know what to say after that kind of, good analysis and very comprehensive comparison, I think, between all of those countries. So I really thank you for that presentation that really pushes a little bit the reflection on what is decentralization for the Arab world today, and what is next in a way. So I think certain key ingredients for decentralization. Maybe it wasn't very enough emphasized. The why of decentralization, because we tend to take it as a little bit of a for granted process. So a little bit of pushed by an Occidental agenda or a foreign agenda or else, but we tend to forget why the decentralization process is necessary and useful for the Arab world. Historically, it's been driven by political, economic efficiency reasons, and enhanced service delivery in a way, and bringing that closer to people. And it is undoubtedly a combination of all of the above. So there is no decentralization process that happened in the world without having some kind of a good balance between all of those rationales in order to build a good decentralization process. In the Arab world, it's been very mitigated process and very much driven by political reasons purely. Be it you mentioned Lebanon, Tunisia, Iraq, Jordan, etc. I think the political drive was the strongest drive. A little bit of a notion that maybe services could be better managed at the local level, but that happened also in a very uncomprehensive manner, very fragmented manner, etc. So I think to go back, decentralization in the Arab world today is necessary. I think it is important to balance political power between national, regional, and local, allow the creation of local elite, regional elite, that will eventually climb up the ladder to be part of the national elite as well, the political elite, I mean. It is important for economic and efficiency reasons. I think, day after day, we're noticing that, a central government is unable to leverage the potential economic to really act and leverage the value of its entire territory. So, you end up, of course, having what we call spatial biases, because you cannot focus on everything. So you tend to have punctual interventions as a national government in specific areas where you consider having too much potential or too much problems. So this is somehow the bias of national government. We saw that in Tunisia with over-investing in the south, for example, after the revolution, where there have been certain problems. Same in Iraq, same in Jordan, same most countries in the Arab world, where we saw a very, very strong central bias to areas where you have all a major important economic potential, coastal areas, tourism areas, trade centers, etc., or an overemphasis on problem centers, such as usually the marginalized territories, fragility areas, or conflict and fragile areas. Those that we've done a lot of work in Tunisia on lagging areas and fragile areas, also in Morocco, etc. So those biases tend to be working for central government. So promoting a sane and healthy decentralization process with good local and regional governments help those entities that are created tap into the maximum of their potential and allow the central government to focus on really problem scenarios or big tickets as big potential areas. So, but you give the resources for those territories to day and continuously being investing and tapping into their potential and trying to max that out. The third point, which is extremely important and which I work a lot on, which is the service delivery, the technical dimension of things. You want to make sure that the decentralization process at the end of the day serves some kind of a noble objective, which is to improve people's living conditions. Decentralization for decentralization doesn't make any sense. So you really need to make sure that that decentralization process at the end of the day bring better services, bring better quality of life to people. And to be able to do that, there are multiple dimensions that are needed. And I didn't see that reflected in the analysis. I think it's still at the macro level in a way, but I think it's very important. You cannot venture into a decentralization process without having a very balanced devolution of power on the human level, so really staffing those local and regional entities effectively. At the political level, so giving them really the leverage to do what they have to do, be it in terms of mandate, responsibilities, etc. At the financial level, because in many cases we've seen it from Tunisia, Morocco, into Jordan, and going through Lebanon, etc. We do see that there is a disconnect between what we give in terms of mandate and responsibilities for those local and regional government and what we give them in terms of financial resources. And we tend to somehow drop those financial resources one drop at a time, and giving them 100 responsibilities and giving them 10 resources in terms of 10x resources, while the kind of share of responsibility needs to be shared in terms of resources, and the way resources are shared should be also understood comprehensively when it comes to own source revenues, when it comes to fiscal revenues and local fiscality and regional fiscality that needs to be developed, and also in terms of transfers that are some kind of a additional resource that central government provides. The final point is on the technical. Local and regional governments need to have the technical tools so that they can deliver eventually on their responsibilities. They could plan better their services, they could plan better their economies and their local and regional economies. They can, mentioned earlier, the waste management sectors, etc. They understand the complexity of the sectors we're delivering, we're asking them to deliver, and giving them the right tools and instruments to do that. So really, that decentralization process needs to be comprehensive at that sense in a way. So where do we go now? What's the outlook a little bit on the Arab world, and what is it that we need to push for? What is it that we need to see in terms of direction? I think there are corrective measures that are needed, and there are forward-looking measures that are needed. Corrective measures that are needed because when we look into the decentralization process in the Arab world, and when governments themselves auto-assess themselves, they put themselves into a competition with the local government and saying, well, you gave you power, but you didn't deliver. So I think there is some kind of auto-assessment, an efficient and effective auto-assessment that is needed, and to be correcting the path that has been going on until now. So it needs to be a constructive auto-assessment and not a destructive auto-assessment. Because most governments in the region look into the decentralization process, say, well, we promised the Americans, the Europeans, the donors, etc., that we're going to move forward decentralization. But you see, it was worse. We used to deliver services better. We used to manage that process better. So, we gave them a chance. They didn't succeed. That's a little bit of the discourse in Tunisia today. While actually the discourse should be, what did we do wrong in this decentralization process? And how can we do it better to be able to achieve the noble objectives that we had mentioned earlier? And that auto-assessment and should really focus on filling urgent and critical gaps so that the decentralization process stabilizes and functions better. That could be really filling certain technical gaps, certain human resources gaps, certain financial gaps, and certain technical and service delivery gaps. So that's extremely important to really stabilize that sector, that way of governance, and give it a regent. The second is the forward-looking, as I mentioned. Forward-looking, I think governments in the region and people in the region, I think also because we have a lot of too much of a centralizing cult in the Arab world. So people, government, social contract need to understand that there is no government in the world that moved from low middle income into middle income, that moved from middle income to upper middle income, or moved from upper middle income to anything, to a prosperous or nation without having an effective decentralization process. Name me one country in the world that was able to move the ladders of development without having an effective decentralization process in place and an evolving decentralization process that moves forward with the development process of those countries. So I think as a forward look, we need to see how each of those countries will be able to evolve and to push its decentralization process to deliver on its developmental outcomes and not the opposite. The decentralization process, it's not a development outcome, it's a tool, it's an instrument, it's part of your governance model, it's part of your social contract to help those countries deliver better on those development processes. So to wrap up, as I've been asked to do so, I think we need to make sure that we learn from the lesson, from the good things we've done. We look into each other's experiences, and maybe that hasn't been mentioned enough. But Jordan is embarking on a very ambitious process, for example, mirroring a little bit what's happening in Morocco or the experience of Morocco. And those two experiences, I think, are quite interesting, quite ambitious. They're moving into a local regional type of governance that helps really deliver on the different levels of ambition that are required. But many other countries, I think, especially Lebanon, especially Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, they have a lot to do today to push the boundaries a little bit forward and to be able to think what do they want from the centralization process and stop putting local governments as a competition to central government, to think comprehensively on what government do we want at the different levels. Thank you.